A special thanks to my Patreon supporters. What is the most unexplained, supernatural, or paranormal event you've ever witnessed? I was annoyed with my daughter because she hadn't cleaned her room in weeks, so when I walked by her room and saw her standing there, I assumed she was doing what I said. A few minutes later, she walked out of the shower in the bathroom with a towel wrapped around her and asked why I was looking at her strangely. When I asked her who was in her room, she looked scared, too. I never figured out who that was, but they didn't clean up the room either. Was spending the night at a friend's house as a kid, around 12 to 13. Parents weren't home, so we decided to go out, do some ding-dong ditching, get into some young angsty debauchery. We get home, and it's around 1 or 2 in the morning. Cue a ringing of the doorbell. Naturally we think it's the cops or a pissed-off neighbor. My friend had a small window that looked out onto the front porch that you couldn't really see into from outside, so we took a peek at who was calling at such a late hour. Standing at the door was an old woman in a dress and a young boy in a weird nosy outfit. Both were dressed extremely out of period, as this was the 90s, and my friend had never seen either in the neighborhood before. We duck because we're a bit freaked, look again no less than 10 seconds later and they're both gone. Nobody on the street walking away, no cars driving away, they were just gone without a trace. We did not sleep well. Well, Monday I started to worry about my grandpa. The moment of worry passed, and I went about my day. Later on I posted an article about automated lawn mowers, saying that my grandpa would love this, since taking care of his yard was his hobby. Literally right after I hit share, my dad calls me. We all know this feeling. It's that drop in your stomach when you know something terrible has happened, or it's about to. The feeling that your world has changed and there's nothing you can do. Anyways, he tells me that my grandpa was rushed to the hospital with a bladder infection followed by several heart attacks, but he's still alive. I didn't think anything about worrying earlier, at least until I woke up the next morning. My dream that night was what made it click in my head, I guess. In the dream I was sitting in my grandpa's shed watching something, and he sits down next to me. Without any pretense he starts talking. The next few weeks are gonna be hard, and they will test you. Don't worry about me, in a few hours I won't have any use for it. We ended up spending what seemed like hours talking about a lot of personal things, things I honestly didn't know or didn't remember about my grandpa. Most of which my dad and his brother have confirmed to be true, although a little exaggerated apparently. Grandpa didn't die until around noon on Tuesday, pretty much just a few hours, 3-hour time difference, after my dream. I'm not religious, nor will I be, but for duck's sake, what the duck? I know the subconscious mind can do things like this, but some of the details he told me about his life are things I wasn't there for, or even alive for. I'm late to this thread, but reading some of these has compelled me to post. This isn't my story but my mom's. She is an extremely rational person, but this event caused her to have such severe panic attacks that she had to return and live with her parents for 6 months. All of this happened a few years before I was born. My mom's first husband was a Navy pilot during the Gulf War. The carrier was about 10 days into its cruise and operating with complete radio silence. She hadn't heard anything from the ship since it left, but that was to be expected. This was a war. On that night, about 10 days into the cruise, my mom woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. She saw her husband standing in the room. It wasn't an ethereal form either, he appeared solid and utterly the same. The only thing different about him was that his head was shaved. He only had one thing to say, goodbye. This whole experience startled my mom and she couldn't get back to sleep. She went to the kitchen to get some water when the doorbell rang. All military wives know what the late-night doorbell means. Her husband had suffered a massive heart attack and died aboard the carrier. She was grief-ridden but reasoned that the apparition had been a hallucination born of the stress of having a spouse deployed. Besides, with his head shaved, he didn't even look that familiar. Her mother and mother-in-law flew out immediately to plan for the funeral and receive the body. She stayed strong until the first viewing of the body. Her lifeless husband was bald. In a letter from his NFO, the shaved head was explained as the result of a lost bet. There had been no way of knowing that his head had been shaved, and my mom suffered a minor mental break. I have a very strong danger sense that's been proven terrifyingly correct both times I've had it. The first was when I was in high school training for cross country. I would usually run by this lake near my house, but one day I was close and got a very strong NO feeling. It was like fighting against a very strong animal instinct to go any closer. I turned right around and went back to my house. When my mom commented on how short my run was, I explained to her what happened and she seemed alarmed, wondering if I'd had some sort of panic attack. A few days later, police found a body in the lake. The more recent example was when I was riding the DC Metro with my partner sometime last year. We were on the Orange Line, and needed to get off at a stop that was also on the Silver Line. We're on the train when all of a sudden I get this very strong sense again. I told my partner about it, and though at first he was skeptical, he trusted me and we switched lines. Later we found out there was a stabbing on the Orange Line that same night. When I was a child, 10 years old, we lived on the north shore of the Shuswap Lake in BC. It was, then, very rural with a population of 400 spread out over 10 miles of beachfront with farms up in the hills. No town, just a store, a post office and an old Indian trail that wound through the forest for perhaps a half-mile near where I lived. We played on the trail all the time. One afternoon, my family, mother, father, brother, myself and a friend went for a walk along the trail. My friend and I ran ahead at one point, out of sight of everyone. We stopped and were looking around, and off, in the forest was a man, slumped over a fallen, rotting log with chickens pecking around him. I can still feel, and I'm talking 50 years in my past, the adrenaline blasting up my back as the figure lifted its head and looked at us with empty pecked-out eyes. We screamed as both of us saw it and ran back to the adults. When my parents came to the spot with us, only the rotting log was there. To this day, I would not dare walk that path by myself. Not me, but my stepfather's best friend, call him Jim, has supposedly been experiencing paranormal activity since he was a teenager. He's a court reporter, stepdad was a speechwriter, very skeptical and stoic guys. There were countless stories. They got on an elevator full of people in downtown Atlanta, stopped at a floor that was all kinds of wrong 1940s decor, abandoned, dusty, then the elevator went back down and opened on the opposite side of the building. Jim's dog died. A week later the stereo turned on by itself and started playing a song Jim loved to play for his pet. No CD inside. It had snowed the night before and there were paw prints in the backyard leading to the house, but none near the gate. He frequently finds giant piles of coins under his pillow. He lived in London for a time, thinking he'd escaped the spirit, which had begun to scratch him hard on his arms and legs. After 6 months he found a little pile of pennies in his bed, even though he hadn't been carrying American coinage. I personally witnessed one strange event while Jim was around. Was walking down the stairs and felt something whip past my head and heard it hit the wall. Looked down and saw a quarter dated 1948. I thought my sister was messing with me, but she was down at the lake with everyone else. I lived in a haunted house with 3 roommates. They lived there for a couple of weeks before I did and swore up and down that a young woman was haunting the house. One of them said they had some incense manually extinguished when they weren't home. Another one said they were feeling around in the dark looking for a light switch and felt the hair on the top of someone's head. Someone that wasn't there when the light came on. I, being a good and proper atheist and knowing my roommates were kinda potheads, thought it was all bollocks and that they were paranoid. A month or so after I moved in, I was laying in bed when I heard a girl crying in the hallway. 2 of my roommates were girls, so I got up to do the requisite investigating and consoling. I opened my door to see who it was, only to discover that I was the only person home at that time. I'm still not a major believer in the supernatural, but I won't rule anything out now. So much paranormal shit happened to me when I was a kid. One that has always stuck was when I was about 3 or 4 years old. Back then I used to randomly wake up in the middle of the night really often for no known reason. I was still sleeping in my parents' bed at the time, so I would just lay in bed and look around. I swear, every fucking time I'd look at the doorway to the living room, I would see two really tall figures standing there. They looked like the old farm couple in that one painting. Except they had hollow eyes and they were thinner. They never really didn't do anything but stare back at me at first. One night was especially weird. I woke up as usual and saw them standing there in front of the doorway again. Only this time something felt a bit more off than usual. The ceiling fan was on high and the blades were going so fast that the entire fixture was moving back and forth. I look back at the figures and they have some really dark, creepy grins on their faces. I got scared and buried myself in the blankets, hoping they'd go away. Then all I heard was the ceiling fan spinning even faster. Somehow, the beads at the end of the switches were tapping against the glass light cover furiously. I peeked up out of my covers and the two figures were right next to the bed, standing right over me with their ugly smiles. I screamed bloody murder and the glass cover on the light came off and shattered on the ground. My dad jumped out of bed immediately and turned on the light to see what happened, but the two figures were gone already. I was crying hysterically and took my mom a long time to calm me down. So much other stuff went on while I lived there. That was the worst house I ever lived in. My family owns a cottage on a lake. This lake had a cottage on it 80 years ago where 3 teenage girls died when it burned down. My grandmother was at her cottage at the time and heard the screams from across the lake. Every year around the date, early August I believe, she could still hear the screams. Whatever that was, just a form of PTSD, right? Wrong. My father, who wasn't even born when the fire happened, started hearing the screams when he was young. Out of 4 kids he was the only one to hear them. And when I was younger I started hearing them. The screams echo across the lake, but only my dad and I seem to hear them. It's terrifying. After confronting my dad about this and him telling me about everything, the fire, my grandmother, etc., he said to never go near the old fireplace, still standing after so long, around the date, because the closer you get the louder the screams. Now I try to avoid our cottage around early August. Side note, my dad has a theory as to why we are the only ones that can hear the screams. My grandmother was supposed to stay the night and would have died, but it doesn't explain why my dad and I are the only ones that can hear it. I'm still not sure if I was hallucinating or how else to explain it, but when I was around 11 to 12, I heard something outside and looked out the window to see 3 people dressed in clothes from the 1800s, and it seemed like the color was slightly drained out of them. I asked my stepfather why these people were walking up our driveway. He came over, and there was no one there. Fast forward about 3 years, after seeing these people consistently for a year, I tell my mother and wonder if she can reassure me that I'm not insane. She asked me to describe them in as much detail as I could, and I did. She looked at me dumbfounded as she told me about reoccurring dreams she had as a child, around the same age that I was when I saw them, about the exact same people. A friend and I were walking home on the train tracks one night. It had rained the night before and there were large puddles all around. After getting far enough that the streetlights no longer illuminated our path, we heard splashing up ahead. We stopped and looked at each other, both expecting some sort of wild animal to scurry into the surrounding woods. Instead, we saw a skinny bald man crawling out of the water with a look of fear painted on his face. Half concerned, half terrified, we stared at the man as he struggled towards us. We soon realized this man had no legs. His eyes were wide and his mouth was open, seemingly screaming although no sound. We quickly turned around without speaking a word and took the long way back to my house. I haven't seen this friend in about 7 years and always wonder if he remembers what we saw. I still pass by those same tracks regularly and I always think about that night. I think we saw a ghost of someone that was killed by a train. Many people, even a family friend, had been struck and killed by trains in years leading up to that night. I've never shared this story before. So late to the party, but maybe someone will see this. When I was around 9, we rescued a dog that we named Billy. Billy was a 90-pound pit bull mix. He was fiercely protective of me and my mom, and loved to sleep in bed with my parents. One night I woke up to commotion. My dad was downstairs and my mom was in the hallway. I quickly asked what was going on. My mom told me that my dad had feared someone was breaking in. He was a police sergeant and, after hearing a crash from the first floor of our house, he grabbed his sidearm and went downstairs. He came back up a few moments later looking really worried. He said the house was empty and no signs of forced entry or anything stolen, but all of the pictures on our mantle were face down and a few of the frames were shattered. He also said that Billy, normally the first to rush to defend the house, had sat on the stairs crying and growling and would not follow him down. We all settled back into bed slowly, but what started to worry me was that Billy came to sleep in my room. Now, like I said, he adored my mom. He always slept with my parents. But he laid on his belly by my legs that night and never put his head down. Just kept looking around. I finally drifted off to sleep only to be woken by him standing with his entire body covering mine, and growling the most ferocious growl I'd ever heard come from him. He was growling at the doorway but there was nothing there. I screamed for my parents and I'm not ashamed to admit that I slept in their room for the rest of that night and a few more after that. Posted before, but it's been a long time ago. I was a home health nurse taking care of a girl dying from advanced AIDS. This was in the early 90s. She was legally blind and in such bad shape it took 2 nurses to bathe her and change her bed. Another nurse was with me and this girl asked her who that man was who was standing behind her. She described him as thin, reddish hair, baseball cap, jeans. This other nurse turned utterly white, just stopped what she was doing and left the room. We were almost done anyway. When I went outside, the nurse pulled an old picture out of her wallet. The pic showed a guy almost exactly the same as the girl described. Her dad had died years ago, when she was a kid. The patient died within the next few days. I'd call BS, but the other nurse was literally shaking and had never even been to that patient's house before. Worked at a summer camp for a few summers at an all-boys program. We used radios to communicate. Now, I don't know much about radios, but these were not your everyday radios one buys at Walmart. We had a crazy radius, I'm talking miles. I could be at a hiking spot miles from camp and still be able to reach out. We are the only ones that ever used that frequency, and I don't think anyone could just hop in and talk/listen to us. One night, I woke up to static from my radio. You could make out someone saying something. This went on for a few minutes before the voice got easier to understand. I was dozing in and out of sleep with this sound on the background. My co-counselor woke me up asking me if I heard that from the radio. He quickly got down, grabbed the radio and turned on the lights. The kids in our bunk were waking up. Everyone sat on silence with the static on the background. What I heard next I'll never forget. This voice sounded like a young girl. "Help me, I'm stuck." I ran the radio to the office, where more counselors had already gathered. They had heard the same thing, and the static was still there. We woke up all of camp and did a head count and a radio count. Nothing out of the ordinary. We never know where it came from. Or who it was. The cops were called, but couldn't do much about it. I worked there a few more summers. And every once in a while I would wake up the static from my radio. Always freaks me out. Have had weird experiences my whole life. Here's a couple that stick out. When I was a kid, there was a night when I wasn't feeling well, and I woke up to an old woman in a blue dress pulling my covers up and stroking my hair. For some reason, I didn't feel scared or anything. I asked my mom the next day about it, and she found a picture of my great-grandmother, long deceased, in the blue dress that she was buried in. It was definitely her. I used to live in a foreign country that had experienced a lot of war and violence, especially against indigenous people, and I knew my apartment was haunted. Regularly at night, empty water bottles would be tossed around my bedroom, the lights would go on in the middle of the night, footsteps walking, doors shutting, etc. One night it got really creepy when I felt a large weight depress the end of the bed, like a person sitting. I went to the local market to get some sage or something, and the woman who sold charms would sell any to me, saying I was cursed to walk among them. Ended up moving a couple weeks later and it stopped. I moved into an apartment about 5 years ago with my boyfriend, which, also, had unusual activity. One night, I was home alone, and on the phone with my best friend. All of a sudden, the TV turned on max volume, scaring the crap out of me. I screamed, turned off the TV, and was explaining to my friend what had happened when across the apartment, both the bedroom and bathroom doors slammed shut. It was winter, there were no windows open. I immediately left the house and returned the next day. A ton of other stuff happened there, I can get into it if anyone is interested, but we did a little ghost hunting once we left, and the apartment was empty of furniture. We got responses,